This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 5 and 6 in seminar 3. In the last video, we identified some distinctions between neurosis and psychosis concerning their respective relations to reality, the function or lack thereof of the big other, and the function of speech and language. Lectures 5 and 6 continue Lacan's attempt to contrast psychosis from neurosis on the structural level. In this video, the following questions will be addressed. 1. What does it mean for the big other to deceive us? 2. How are psychotic and poetic discourse distinct from one another? And 3. In the case of Schreber, how do the patient's delusions take hold? Lacan indicates that to be captivated by a meaning, as in psychosis, is not the same as to express that meaning in discourse, whereby it comes to bear on and be reconciled with other received meanings. However, the critical word here is received. The received dimension of language turns it into a shared symbolic system concretized in historical relations. Such received discourse is most centrally situated in the big other, whose subjectivity, Lacan states, is the hub of the function of speech. And for Lacan, this subjectivity of the big other is marked by the capacity for convincing and lying. Lacan has identified the capacity of the big other to lie on a few occasions in this seminar, and I think it may be helpful to unpack this a little more. In seminar 1, Lacan indicates that the superego, or censor, which are close to the big other, conceptually speaking, operates through deception since it is responsible for the split in the subject that leads one part to be accessible and recognized, while the other part inaccessible and forbidden. This doesn't necessarily clarify the nature of lying and the big other, however. Another difficulty is that this formulation can lead us to imagine some literal authority figure speaking to me and deceiving me. It's vital to keep in mind that the big other is in speech itself, in our discourse. And recall that the unconscious is the discourse of the other. So the possibility of being deceived is not something other than a doubt toward our very own speech, within which the big other secretly functions. Now, don't go to the other extreme and think that the unconscious is something inside the mind either. We inhabit language, so the unconscious is also, and probably most essentially, outside us, just as language resides outside us, even while it's inside of us. This internalized exteriority is the extimate quality of the big other. When we doubt, then, when we are aware that the other can deceive us, this places doubt at the core of our encounter with ourselves in some regards. It is what opens up the gap within us, the split between I and me, that subverts the radical kind of certainty that's evident in psychotic clinical structures. You can even see this in young children who've not passed through the Oedipal complex. At the time of making this video, we're approaching the holiday season, and sure enough, Santa Claus is coming. And many young kids have no doubt about Santa's existence. Santa is as real to them as their concrete living parents are. It's not until the big other becomes incorporated into speech that doubt begins to set in. It's a doubt that's not merely calling Santa into question, but is also the beginning of more generally doubting other things that have been held to be true. It is the awareness that the other can and has already perhaps lied to me, and that, and this is the important point, I carry that lie now in my own speech, which in a sense can be experienced now as a doubt toward myself. Now, returning to this lecture in seminar 3, even though the big other is marked by deception through speech, it introduces a mediated reality, a structuration of the real that does indeed appear to us as non-deceptive, giving rise to this dialectic between the possibility of deception and that which does not deceive. That non-deceptive something serves an essential function for the subject who would otherwise be unable to trust anything external to it. This non-deceptive reality, filtered through the symbolic speech of the big other, takes on various forms, from the Judeo-Christian conception of God to the celestial spheres of Aristotle, those heavenly bodies that one always finds in the same place. So although the child may come to doubt Santa Claus's existence, another more durable reality emerges that is resistant to doubt, and that one places their faith in. And this has traditionally been the place of God, but also now the laws of nature, materiality, etc. Most scientists and perhaps individuals of so-called modern sensibilities would think it absurd to consider matter untrustworthy. It's out of the question that matter should deceive us, Lacan says. And when our experiments do prove to be incorrect, we're the ones who make the mistake and not matter, not the laws of nature. This will be an important point when considering how Schreber's notion of God functions for him in his delusional discourse in contrast to the neurotic discourse. Now, to appreciate this difference, Lacan returns to the structural dimensions of neurotic discourse. Typically, a primordial affirmation is made of the symbolic that allows for some primitive symbolization of one's infantile relations, forming a symbolic chain that comprises an internal coherence that keeps the subject and its world from completely disintegrating. Because of this, the subject is capable of various psychological functions, such as what is often translated as condensation. Through this function, symbolic substitutions become possible. As such, Shakespeare can say, Juliet is the sun, in describing her radiant beauty without the metaphor collapsing into something literal. Moreover, it's for this reason why Lacan can say Schreiber is no poet. It's because his speech does not produce such metaphors. He contrasts Schreiber with St. John of the Cross, a 16th century Spanish mystic who wrote on similar themes concerning nuptial relations with the divine. However, Lacan notes, even a cursory review of how language functions in their respective writings highlights a contrast. Now, Lacan is making a couple of interesting points. One of them is contradicting that view of those who have claimed some converging logic between the experience of psychosis and that of mysticism. Another point is that it demonstrates a contrast between the thought process of the psychotic and that of the poet. And it's worth quoting Lacan here, where he states, "There is poetry whenever writing introduces us to a world other than our own, and also makes it become our own, making present a being, a certain fundamental relationship. Poetry is the creation of a subject adopting a new order of symbolic relations to the world. There is nothing like any of this in Schreber's memoirs." A related psychological function here is repression, which Lacan states elsewhere is structured like a metaphor. In repression, there's an inability of granting discourse to an aspect of the subject's speech which is linked to earlier infantile relations. Nonetheless, this speech that cannot be made explicit continues to function as a primitive language through symptoms that are expressed in the imaginary dialectic between oneself and the little other. Indeed, once this primary language is repressed, it immediately finds expression in another form, another language. This is what we find in neurosis. It's the manufacturing of one language in the place of another, more primitive language. However, unlike that condensation proper to poetry, which makes connections across nodes of signification situated in a shared symbolic world, repression introduces a split in the subject whereby that primitive symbolic chain, formed through the primordial affirmation, does not hang together. The subject finds the law imposed upon it through the symbolic, and law is always necessary for any symbolization. And in being imposed, the subject finds this intolerable in light of their position and the demand to make certain sacrifices on the level of meaning. So to deal with this intolerable situation, certain acts, discourses, and behaviors must be repressed, disconnected in some way from the larger symbolic chain. This disconnected portion of the chain does continue to insist beneath the surface, as we learned in Seminar 2. And it's through this insistence the chain expresses its demands, now transformed into neurotic symptoms. These symptoms offer substitute satisfactions in place of the desire for recognition which the unconscious subject seeks. However, here's the crucial point. These are symbolic substitutions, and as such, the imaginary remains a symptomatic misrecognition of unconscious desire. Now we're in a better position to return to the structures of psychosis in light of this consideration of neurosis. One prominent theme that emerges here is that psychosis is a matter of certainty. Lacan indicates that one does not necessarily believe in the reality of their hallucinations. They are, to varying extents, aware that their reality is uncertain. However, these subjects are certain about the meaning of these hallucinations. This certainty of meaning is a very prominent trait of psychosis, more so than any kind of mistaken perceptual experience. And as psychosis progresses, the subject becomes increasingly certain of things that are more and more unreal. We can see a clear contrast here between this certainty and the kind of poetic discourse that involves metaphor. Shakespeare is not mistaking Juliet for the sun. The signifier Juliet and the signifier sun remain situated within their respective common discourses that make sense of them. They're still linked within a signifying chain. Metaphor then makes connections amidst this chain, opening new paths. However, in psychosis, that chain is not bound by a law that maintains the distinction of signifiers while employing them poetically. Instead, Juliet is the sun. As such, there is a collapse of symbolic functions into imaginary understandings. Lacan provides us a much more in-depth consideration of the Schreiber case in these two lectures, and it will be worth repeating some of the main points to understand how it illustrates the distinctions between neurosis and psychosis. Schreiber mentions a thought that came to him one day. It really must be rather pleasant to be a woman succumbing to intercourse. The thought left Schreiber surprised and even indignant, concluding that it came from somewhere other than himself. His treating psychiatrist at that time was suspected by him of having contacted the patient using nerve language unknown to others. Only certain souls could contact Schreiber's nerves through divine rays that provide information or make requests of him. Eventually, he systematizes this all into a delusion, coming to believe that the only way to save the world was to transform into a woman so to be impregnated by God and thereby recreate a new people. Lacan has us consider what accounts for the transition from Schreiber's initial fleeting thought to this firmly established delusion that later takes hold. Critical to considering this transition from one to the other is that it is not through the repressive mechanism found in neurosis. Instead, the dialectic between subject and other, which in neurosis is played out on the symbolic plane, in psychosis is played out on the plane of the imaginary, whereby the subject's discourse is transformed into a phantasmagoria, but delivered with the utmost certainty for the subject. This term phantasmagoria is insightful here. It is defined as a confused group of shifting real or imagined images or deceptive appearances as in a dream or imagination. Second, it is a changing scene made up of many elements. And this third definition was particularly interesting to me, that it was a form of horror theater whereby magic lanterns projected frightening images of skeletons, demons, and ghosts onto a screen, creating illusions in which the figures would increase or decrease in size, pass into one another, or dissolve. Now, this image I'm showing you right now depicts this phantasmagoria, and it reminds me a great deal of Lacan's optical schema, which I think seems pretty appropriate here, since this schema presented in Seminar 1 was how he attempted to illustrate the imaginary function for the subject. Now, how does this imaginary dialectic get established? There is a primitive rejection that occurs in the subject's relationship to the symbolic that results in something not being symbolized. This is in contrast to neurosis, as we've already mentioned, whereby primitive affirmation of the symbolic precedes the dialectic between subject and big other, as well as the possibility for repression. The psychotic phenomenon then emerges when this unsymbolized dimension of the subject's being now appears in the real. Lacan also talks about it as the emergence of an enormous meaning that is not tethered to any common discourse and system of symbolization that would situate it and make it meaningful for others. Nonetheless, its appearance to the subject is threatening and total strangeness, which is how that initial thought of Schreber's appears to him. It will be this strange and threatening foreign thought that will eventually bring about a progressive reshaping of his world. Schreber is unable to negate the thought, as maybe would happen in neurosis. He's incapable of making Verneinung succeed. So there is no symbolic compromise or exchange of repressed discourse in exchange for an expressed one, that being neurotic symptoms. Consequently, what in neurosis remained at the symbolic level and brought into a symbolic pact mediated by the big other instead finds its way into the little other. Resulting from this is an imaginary proliferation and deformation as asymbolic signifiers come to collapse upon this enormous meaning which has found its way in the real, following the rejection of its inclusion into a symbolic system. The real is no longer thoroughly mediated by the deceptive big other, and so what the subject encounters in the real, and which is lived through the imaginary of the subject, is taken at face value for what it is, without the mediating space whereby the received discourse of others can introduce reality. Reality is instead encountered through the little other, who for Schreiber is God. However, unlike the non-deceptive God introduced through the symbolic, the God that always remains the same and forever and everywhere for the subject, we now instead discover decomposing beings and alternating structures, giving rise to another dialectic, this time between the subject in its fragmented body and the imaginary universe that is its inverted image. This dialectic between Schreiber and God, or between ego and little other, outside symbolic structuring, nonetheless remains under the demand of the symbolic order to integrate what has emerged in the real for the subject. This herein is where the delusion forms, and we get the transition in Schreiber from an alien thought to a systematic formulation of beliefs that encompasses his entire world. So we can start to see that the symbolic still has a role to play here in psychosis, but it's not functioning in the typical manner. I'd like to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.